I'm going to sit back and listen to what you have to tell us about where to next for the Kākāpo. It's all yours.
Great. So, tēnā koutou katoa. Tēnā koutou kua hui mai nei I tēnei wā ki tēnei hui, ki tēnei webinar. It's fantastic to see so many people from all around the world. I'm having a look at the bottom. I see there's quite a few people coming in from in the United States and various different places. Yeah, so it's great to have you all here. So, ko Andrew Digby aho, ko te kai tohu pūtau o Kākāpo me takahe o te papa atawhai e mahi ana. So that means I'm Andrew Digby and I'm the scientist for the Kākāpo and the Tākehē recovery programs for the Department of Conservation here in New Zealand. And today I'm going to talk about Kākāpo, and in particular, I want to talk a little bit more about what's coming up for Kākāpo. Normally, when I give a talk like this, I'll often do a bit of a Kākāpo 101, but I'm going to skip a lot of that today and assume that most of you know a bit about Kākāpo, and I hope that's okay. You can ask questions later if not. But so what I want to have a bit more time to get down to the nitty gritty of what's happening next in a bit more detail that you might not know. And so I'm going to talk just briefly about the recent past of Kākāpo, what's happened, and some of the methods that have got us to where we are today. And then I'm going to talk about some of these new challenges that we're facing. And yeah, when I'm talking here today, this is just me talking, but I'm talking on behalf of a much bigger team. There's at least 13 permanent members of the Kākāpo and Tākehē team, all working towards these same goals. And also there's a lot of people come before us. There's generations, decades and decades of hard work has gone into getting where we are today. So what I'm presenting today is accumulation of all of that effort. And you might know a little bit about the story of Kākāpo in New Zealand. Just 45 years ago in the mid-70s, we didn't know of any Kākāpo populations, and it was thought by quite a few people that they might have been extinct. Even as a result, even after a lot of searches, over 60 searches had gone on throughout the 1950s and 60s. And there was this last-ditch attempt to try and find Kākāpo populations in Fiordland, so places like you see here, the Gulliver and Esperance Valley. This is Milford Sound in the background there, and on Rakiura as well. And this place here actually is where one of the last remaining Kākāpo was found, this very famous Kākāpo called Richard Henry. Just high up on the left of the screen there, you'll see those big cliffs, and 1,000 meters up there, this Kākāpo, Richard Henry, was found. And he's quite an important Kākāpo because he was the last of the Fiordland Kākāpo to breed and to produce offspring which are still alive in this current generation of Kākāpo. And he's genetically really different. So it's a really, he's very valuable from a genetic point of view, and it could make a big difference to the survival of the species. And so this is quite an iconic photograph, this one, with Chris Kennedy and John Cheen and Don Merton there. In fact, it's so iconic that some of our rangers tried to recreate it a few years ago. I think with some degree of success. So this is some of our team on Whenua a few years back. And so all of that work, all of those decades of work, stretching right back, in fact, to the 1890s and early 1900s, was Richard Henry, the man trying to save Kākāpo, translocating them onto Resolution Island in Fiordland. And then back through the 80s and the 90s, there's a huge amount of effort went on to try and save Kākāpo. And this is what the population has done since then. The population reached a low of 51 birds in the mid-1990s. And you can see how it's climbed since then to the 211 birds that we have today. But you'll see that steady climb has not been linear, I guess. There's been these sudden jumps, and you'll see these steep jumps in population in 2002, 2009, 2016, and 2019. And these are those big breeding years. These are the years that really make a difference to the change in the Kākāpo population. So Kākāpo don't breed every year. They normally breed about every 2 to 3 years. And last year in 2019 was the biggest breeding season that we've known in the history of Kākāpo conservation. We had an awful lot of things happening. It was a very busy time and a very productive time. We had a lot of this happening. We had a lot of Kākāpo chicks hatching. In fact, we had 86 chicks hatch. And just to show you some of these numbers, we had 252 eggs laid last year in 2019. And that you can see here on this graph just some of how that compares to previous years. The previous breeding season, 122 in 2016, that was the previous record. And you can see that last year just dwarfed that. And part of the reason for that is because we effectively had 2 breeding seasons in one last year. We did something what's known as double clutching. We forced quite a few of the Kākāpo to nest again. Quite a lot of the females nested really early last year, and we managed to persuade 30 of the 50 females to nest again. That produced an extra 84 eggs. In itself, those 84 eggs would have been like a massive breeding season just on their own. So yeah, we got a lot more eggs than we would have otherwise done as a result of that. But with Kākāpo, the number of eggs does not equal the number of chicks that hatch. Kākāpo have got really poor fertility, and just under about half of the eggs that are laid are fertile. So you can see here, of those 252 eggs, just 118 of them are fertile. So we've already lost quite a lot of possible productivity here. And then we lose some more in the egg. So Kākāpo chicks can die within the egg before they hatch quite a lot, and we actually ended up with just 86 hatching. And I say just, you know, that's still a massive, massive number, but you can see the loss, the potential loss of productivity here. And then out of those 86 that hatched, 72 of them fledged. That is an incredible number. The previous record that we had was 34 chicks in 2016 and in 2009. And yeah, so it's a really, really huge breeding season, a massive increase in productivity. There was only 147 adults alive at the start of 2019. So to produce 72 chicks from that population was quite incredible. But from those graphs I've just shown you, you can see one of the big problems that we have with Kākāpo is this infertility and the difference between the number of eggs that are laid and the number of chicks which are fledged. Now, because there's this infertility issue, that we have to be very intensive with Kākāpo. Every time there's a Kākāpo nest, we want to make sure that as many chicks and eggs survive as possible. And so we do some quite intensive breeding management. And that's all based around these transmitters that Kākāpo wear. Every single Kākāpo has a name. Every single Kākāpo wears one of these smart transmitters. So these transmitters transmit in the radio frequencies, and they enabled us to find the Kākāpo, but not only that, they enabled us to help monitor their activity. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, how that works. We can monitor their nesting and their mating, for example. And when they do nest, it's a big deal. Every single Kākāpo nest gets a lot of attention. We put quite a lot of monitoring equipment in it. So we'll put things like this infrared sensor across the entrance, so we know when the female arrives and departs. We put an infrared camera inside so we can see what's going on. And we put proximity sensors in as well. And so we can also monitor remotely the female attendance at the nest. And another part of the management that we do around breeding seasons is feeding Kākāpo, providing supplementary food. And we do that to make sure that all of the Kākāpo are in optimal breeding condition. And now when we feed them individually, and we make sure that all of the males basically can eat as much food as they can. They need to have lots and lots of reserves to sustain them through the booming period, their display period throughout the summer. But the females don't get it quite so easy. They get put on a little bit of a diet. And I'll just explain that to you now, why we do this. And I think Nick's going to be able to play the video for me now. So this is a feeding station at night, and this is a female Kākāpo, and hopefully it's coming through okay on your stream, but you might see she's moving quite slowly, and this is not slowed down, this is real time. So she's approaching this feeding station, and at the back right there you'll see a black box, and that's got the proximity detector in it. So that detects her transmitter on her, and if it's the right bird, then it unlocks the lid and she can have a feed. And you'll notice she's standing on some scales. Those scales log her weight, so we get a remote record of what her weight is like. So that's great. And now if we just skip to the next slide, should be another video. Now the same night, this is a young male Kākāpo coming along. You can see he's a little bit bigger. He's greedy, he wants someone else's food. He's probably just eaten all of his own, and he tries to get in. But the data logger realizes it's not the right Kākāpo, so it locks him out. It locks the lid of the hopper. He's quite persistent. He tries to get the food out, and he's like an angry person with a vending machine. He shakes it, and manages to get a few little bits of pellet food out. But he doesn't get much. And what this system does, it enables us to feed every Kākāpo individually. Every Kākāpo can have its own diet. And so the reason we want to do that is because we want to manage their weight independently. And the reason we do that is to try and do something about the sex ratio of Kākāpo. Now, this is a graph showing what the sex ratio of Kākāpo is like. So if it's a line of 1, you can see along the top, that means 1 male to every female chick is produced. And in the early stages of Kākāpo conservation, there were a lot more male chicks than female chicks being produced. We had about 2/3 of the chicks were males. Then supplementary feeding started, and that ratio stayed about the same. But in the early 2000s, the supplementary feeding was optimized. The females were kept on a ration so that they were between about 1.5 and 1.9 kilograms. And since then, that sex ratio has gone up to nearer parity, so to nearer 1. And this is, we think, a demonstration of something called sex allocation theory. If the females have lots and lots of food, plenty of provisions, they're more likely to produce male chicks, because male chicks are harder to produce. And if you're going to produce one, you better make sure you do it when there's lots of food around, so you can produce a big, strong male. You don't want to produce a weak male because he won't be able to compete and pass on his genetic material very well. So this is, I guess, a demonstration of kind of in a microcosm of how the Kākāpo program works. It's a science-based program. We try to do things like, let's look at the science, and then to try and, in this case, we've actually been able to manipulate the sex ratio using the technology which enables us to feed each Kākāpo individually. So that's the kind of management approach which is, I guess, the program adopts. But despite that, there's still lots of challenges with Kākāpo. Kākāpo are a critically endangered species, and they're critically endangered for a reason. There's only 211 of them left. They could go extinct very quickly if particularly bad things happen. One of the main problems that I've focused on, I've just mentioned earlier, is the infertility. So I mentioned how less than half of the eggs, around about half of the eggs are fertile, and only about 1/3 of the eggs that are laid turned into chicks that fledge. So this is a massive loss of productivity here. That green slice of that pie chart is what we get at the end of it. All that other 2/3 of it is potential lost productivity. We get lots of infertile eggs. We also get lots of dead embryos as well. So this happens quite a lot, and we suspect that there's quite a strong genetic component here. Kākāpo are very inbred, and we think that this might be having quite an impact on the embryo development inside the egg. So the infertility is a big issue. Another issue is disease. Kākāpo have been beset by a few disease issues over the sort of last couple of 2 or 3 decades. In particular, in the last about 18 years or so, there's been a disease called cloacitis, or the more evocatively named crusty bum, which has caused quite a lot of problems for Kākāpo. It's killed probably 1, maybe 2 individuals, would have killed a lot more without vet intervention. And then you might have seen last year we had this fungal pneumonia outbreak called aspergillosis in Kākāpo. That killed 9 Kākāpo, affected 21, and it would have killed a lot more of those 21 if it wasn't for the amazing vet care from various centres around New Zealand, particularly at Auckland Zoo, Dunedin Wildlife Hospital, and Wild Base at Palmerston North at Massey, that have been able to intervene and save a lot of these birds. So that disease is a real ongoing threat. That's something we're working to manage at the moment, and it's something with the threat of climate change altering New Zealand's climate we might see more of this sort of thing. So fertility and disease are 2 issues. And then another one, which I just want to focus on in a little bit more detail now, is this interesting issue of space. And we've got this kind of nice problem. The Kākāpo population has increased by 70% in the last 4 years. And suddenly, we weren't expecting it to grow quite that fast. And we suddenly found ourselves with this issue of where do we put all these new Kākāpo? So first of all, what's the problem? Well, our 2 main breeding islands on Anchor and Whenua are reaching capacity. And I think if Nick's just going to play a video now, these are some GPS data, just an example to give it an idea of what's happened over the last few years. So this is GPS location data on not the entire population, only about 60% of the population on the island. But what I think it shows quite clearly is that this island, this is Whenua, and one of the 2 main breeding islands, is filling up. So both of those main breeding islands are reached capacity. In fact, we normally try and limit those islands to around about 70 individual Kākāpo. At the moment, we've got over 90, just under 100 on each of those islands. So they're full, and we can't keep them full because we see lots of problems in a breeding season if we do that. So we need new places to put them. But new places to put Kākāpo are not simple. These animals always cause lots of problems with Kākāpo. We cannot have Kākāpo where there are cats. We cannot have Kākāpo where there are ferrets. And we cannot have Kākāpo where there are high numbers of stoats. Maybe low numbers of stoats will be okay, but they need to be quite low. So finding new places is tricky. And the fact is that there actually are no longer any predator-free sites suitable for Kākāpo. And so we need to find new places. And I'll just talk a little bit here about what those options might be. These are our Kākāpo breeding islands at the moment. So 2 in the south of New Zealand on the left, Anchor Island and Whenua, and Hauturu in the north of New Zealand on the right. Anchor and Whenua are our main sites. Hauturu is a little bit of a trial island at the moment. We also have Kākāpo Te Kākahu, or Chalky Island in Chalky Inlet. That is a reasonably small site, but it's currently our bachelor pad. It's our duds and studs island where we have males who we don't want them to be part of the breeding program. So this is our first choice. So when we're looking for new sites, this is a good potential breeding island. There's good breeding habitat there, we think. And so we have plans to make this a breeding island. So we'll have to move those males off and find somewhere else to put those bachelor Kākāpo. And these are some of the sites which we're kind of considering. We haven't made any firm decision yet, but these are some of the places that we're interested in. And of those, Rakiura, Stewart Island is the obvious place to put Kākāpo. It's where most of the current population of Kākāpo descend from. It's great Kākāpo habitat, but it has cats and it has rats, and we won't be able to put them there. We won't be able to breed there until those animals are gone. We're also considering Maungatautari as a trial site in the north, in the Waikato. But let's just focus a little bit on those Fiordland Islands of Resolution Island and Coal Island, because they're places that we're considering as well. And if we look at, this is Resolution Island, and in particular on the left-hand side there, you'll see this peninsula called Taumoana, or Five Fingers Peninsula. It's a large site. It's more than twice the size of Anchor and Whenua, and it could hold a lot of Kākāpo. It's connected to Resolution Island by the small isthmus, and it's got some really potentially quite good Kākāpo habitat. And then Coal down in Preservation Inlet is about the same size as Anchor Island. It also has some great forest habitat, lots of rimu. Could be quite a good place for Kākāpo to breed there. But there are issues with these islands. Stoats are there. So both of these islands have been eradicated. Stoats have been eradicated there, but they kind of have persisted over time. So this is a map here of Resolution Island, and you'll see Five Fingers Peninsula on the left. Each one of these dots represents a stoat capture during the stoat eradication just over 10 years ago. And since then, the stoat numbers have dropped right back. You can see 2011, 2015, the numbers are starting to build up again. But the numbers have been quite low on the peninsula, on Taumoana or Five Fingers over that time. But then the last couple of years, and especially this year, we've had a big stoat plague. You might have seen and read about the beach mast throughout New Zealand, and the numbers have been very, very high over the last year. And this summer, stoat numbers have been as high as we've seen them in probably decades. And so you can see from this graph of the number of stoat captures on these 3 different islands, on Coal and Five Fingers and the main Resolution Island, the numbers have been reduced down, but they've bounced back up again in this last year or so. So this is a real problem. It's a result of this mega mast, this huge amounts of beach seed and then mice and rats for the stoats to prey on. But this is definitely an issue for these sites, but we're still interested in pursuing those. And regardless of where we go for next for Kākāpo, with these sort of sites, we might be putting Kākāpo in places where there are stoats, which in a way is quite a scary prospect, because we know that stoats are what caused or helped to cause the extinction of Kākāpo in places like Fiordland around about just over 100 years ago. But on the other hand, it's kind of a little bit of an exciting time. It's a little bit of a gamble. We do know that Kākāpo and stoats have coexisted together, for example, on places like Maud Island in the 1990s. And if we think if there's low densities of stoats, and certainly if you're talking about male Kākāpo, you're not talking about nesting at this stage with females, then we hope and we think that Kākāpo might be able to persist in low numbers of stoats. We don't want to go there. We'd like, ideally, to have predator-free islands, but in the interim, while we don't have those spaces, those predator-free sites, this is the sort of places that we will be looking at. And if Kākāpo can live on these places, if they can coexist in those low densities of stoats, then that opens up the potential for a lot more habitat too. So that's one of the issues, this issues of space. That's a real, that's something that we're working quite hard on. And the other thing that we need to do as well is just to be able to step back a little bit, because Kākāpo conservation is intensive. It's famously intensive, probably the most intensively managed species in the world, or one of them certainly in the wild. We try to step back every year. We try to be less and less intensive, and we rely quite heavily on technology for that. We want to use technology to be able to manage Kākāpo a little bit more efficiently. And one of the ways that we've been doing that is remote monitoring. So being able to monitor remotely. And we have an incredible input here from the Department of Conservation Electronics team, who produce some pretty amazing gadgets and gizmos for us. One of the ways that we can manage remotely is with mating data loggers. And I think Nick's just about to play a video. So this is Sinbad. And this is kind of the motion a male Kākāpo makes when he's mating. And he'll do it for a long time, at least half an hour, 45 minutes, sometimes over an hour. And what happens when a male does that is the transmitter on his back detects that movement, and it turns on a receiver. So that receiver detects any other Kākāpo nearby, so that will detect the female that he's mating with. So we can actually, that transmitter will then log that mating, and the male Kākāpo will then wander near one of our data loggers. We have a network of data loggers across the island. It will take that data, transmit it through the network onto the internet. So we can, wherever we are, anywhere in the world, we can log onto a computer and we can see the night before which male Kākāpo have mated, who they've mated with, how long they've mated for, and even a quality score for their mating. So it's kind of a little bit invasive and intensive, and it's real big brother stuff, but it really helps us with our conservation management, and particularly with things like artificial insemination. So the males get a lot of prying into what they're up to, and the females do too. We do the same sort of thing with nest management with these data loggers in the nests. We can tell, for example, when the females are coming and going from the nests, what their activity is like. And we get graphs like this. Each color is a different female Kākāpo, and it's basically how active they've been over a period of time. And you can see when they nest, you get these U-shaped curves here. This is the dip when the female nests. She's not very active. And you might see a couple of double dips on some of these, and that's because last breeding season females nested twice. But this sort of activity also enables us this monitoring enables us to just keep an eye on how the females are doing in the nest, and we can pick up some problems like this too. So for example, with the aspergillosis outbreak last year, we first detected that using these sort of plots, which showed us there was something wrong with incubation. So this remote monitoring enables us to keep an eye on more Kākāpo at the same time in more detail. And you might have heard of the Internet of Things, when your fridge and your iron and your washing machine are all connected to the internet. Well, we have the Internet of Kākāpo things. We have our different data loggers, our mating data loggers, our feed stations, and the nest data loggers, all connected to each other, all connected to the internet, so we can disseminate and we can receive and monitor this information really easily. So we have to be smart about the technology, and there's other ways that we can do that too. One thing that we've been trialing recently is smart eggs. When Kākāpo lay eggs, we actually tend to take those eggs away and artificially incubate them, because we are a little bit more successful at hatching Kākāpo chicks than Kākāpo themselves are. But the eggs that we've used in the past, the dummy eggs, which we replace the real eggs with in the nest, have been a little bit unrealistic. So we decided to make a more realistic one. We took a real egg. This is Alice's egg from 2009. We went to a workshop in Wellington, made a 3D model for us, and then we 3D printed them, so we now have a more realistic dummy egg. But we've gone a little bit further too, because one of the issues that we have with these dummy eggs is that a female will be sitting on a dummy egg, and the real chick real egg will hatch in the incubator. And then when the chick is about a day old, when it's about this big, we will put the chick back into the nest. But often the mother doesn't quite know what to do with it, and she doesn't feed it very well for the first day or so. And so we have to feed it in the nest, which is quite an intensive and quite a risky thing to do. And we think the reason for that is because she doesn't know that a chick is on its way. A real egg with a real chick inside will make noise and make movement before it hatches. So the Doc Electronics team have produced this little smart egg for us. So they've put a microphone, a speaker inside this dummy egg, so it makes noises and it will chirp. It'll make little noises, a bit like a chick will make, so that the female knows that a chick is on its way. So this is the kind of thing which we we try and push, we try and look at our program and try and evaluate where all the little weak points are, where we might be able to refine things and improve things. And these are the sort of incremental improvements that we can make. And we can do things, you might have seen that we've been using drones a little bit too. We used them last year as part of our artificial insemination program to transport the sperm from the male Kākāpo to the female as quickly as possible, because time is everything when you're doing artificial insemination. So we used a drone to do that, which could fly the sperm in about 5 minutes or so what would take a person to walk about an hour and a half. So that's another of ways that we try and push the technology and trying to just maximize the productivity for Kākāpo. So I'm going to wrap things up here so we can have time for questions. But I guess in summary, the threatened species management of these species like Kākāpo, like Tākei, can be very successful if you have a science-based program, if you have a dedicated team working on these problems for a long time. We can do this stuff. We've proven that we can do it. And as the populations grow, you can use technology to be able to operate on bigger scales at more remote sites as well. You have to really link in with the predator control as well. Pretty much all New Zealand species, you come back to this problem of predator-free habitat. We need these habitat sites. You want to make sure that the threatened species programs and the predator-free programs work together so that you're actually helping achieve each other's goals and maximizing the success of these species. And on the other hand, there's real incentives for initiatives like Predator Free New Zealand with species like Kākāpo, because our goal in the Kākāpo program is to put Kākāpo back on the mainland of New Zealand. And we would do that next week if there were suitable habitat-free sites, predator-free habitats. If there were places without stoats, for example. And it doesn't just have to be on island sanctuaries on the mainland too. We could easily have Kākāpo around the big cities if they were free from the predators, things like stoats and cats and dogs that would threaten them there. So this doesn't just have to be something which is out of sight, out of mind. We really could have Kākāpo back on the mainland, back amongst our lives again, like it used to be a couple of 100 years ago. So I'm going to finish there. And just thanks everyone for your attention. It's really good to have so many people listening, and I'll be keen to take some questions.
Absolutely. Brilliant job. Thanks so much. We're not sure whether it was a child or not, but somebody straight away asked, how do we get your job? How can we end up doing what you're doing? Any advice to people who want to be in your space?
Yeah, it's a good question, actually. It's one I get asked quite a lot. And one thing I always say is volunteering is a really great way to get involved, is a really good place to start. Getting involved in some local activities around where you are, you get experience, you get to get contacts, and you get to know different people and what's going on and what some of the problems are. So that's, I think, a really good way to start.
Before we go into some of the other questions we've got, can you do a shout out to your team? So how many in your team based down there in the south?
Yeah, we've got pretty much all of our team are based out of either Invercargill or Te Anau for Kākāpo and Tākei. So we have a combined team. We work on both species, which actually works really well because they kind of tend to have slightly different breeding seasons. So we can divert our effort to where it's needed. And for example, when there's a Kākāpo breeding season, it's all hands to the pump, and we're all Kākāpo rangers out on the island, sort of thing. So so that works quite well.
All right, I'm going to fire some at you, all different kinds of questions. How long do they live for?
That's a good question. We don't actually know. We think an average of about 60 years, but we don't know an upper lifespan yet. And we haven't actually been able to come up with a system which you can age a Kākāpo. We've got some Kākāpo, around about 25 of them in our population. We don't know how old they are, and there's no way of telling yet. So an average of 60, we know that from our transmitter data, from the transmitters that we have on Kākāpo, but maybe more, and maybe up to 90, even 100 years old. We don't quite know yet.
I saw somebody just write in, do they ever try to get stuck into the traps that you put to keep the predators at bay?
Yeah, no, they don't. Any traps that on these islands are very well covered with tunnels and things. We make sure that they're Kākāpo proof.
Charlie's asked, why are Kākāpo fat? Why are they fat?
They're not always fat. They sometimes look fat, especially in the breeding season. So the males put on a huge amount of weight, and they will or pretty much double their weight in a breeding season. And they have to put on huge amounts of reserves. And the reason that they do that is because they'll spend all night, every night for about 3 or 4 months booming, and they don't feed much during that time. So they will then put on this huge amount of weight and then lose it all again. So yeah, you sometimes see pictures of them when they're like that, and they do get really quite fat. They have all these boom sacs, so that helps them make the call. The bigger they are, the better their boom is, the better they sound, the more attractive they are to the females.
Some of these questions you may have answered because they came in early, but we'll just go for it anyway. Do they breed at all in the non-mast seasons?
No, they don't. No, so we need those masting seasons, and that they're all synchronized. Some, if you don't get so much remu fruit, then not all of the females will breed. And like some years, in recent years, and you might get maybe 6 or maybe 10 of the females will breed. In a big year like we had last year, all of the females breed. So it depends on the amount of remu fruit, but yeah, at least a few of them will breed if there's enough remu, if there's a mast.
Sky Cowdill, I think, asked, what is a boom? Just to reiterate what a boom is.
Yeah, so I didn't explain that. So that's the display call that a male Kākāpo will make. He has this series of tracks and bowls, so little scrapes in the ground connected by a series of tracks, and he'll sit in one of these scrapes, one of these bowls. He'll inflate himself up like a football, and he'll make this really low frequency noise, this booming noise, which travels quite a long distance, and that's what attracts the females.
It was funny because we tried to play a bit of one of the booms that you had sent me for the webinar, and we couldn't quite get it to the level for smaller iPads or computers. And I likened it when I listened to it, and it's through a bigger speaker, just like when someone drives past in their car with their subwoofer going at high level.
Yeah, it's right. You pretty much feel it rather than hear it. I mean, it's amazing sound when you're up on, near one of the bowl sites when a male Kākāpo is booming. It's a real visceral sound that you hear, and or you sort of feel it. It's quite amazing.
Somebody, it's Kay, asked earlier why such remote places for them, and why not find them in places that are warmer, and didn't they used to live all around New Zealand?
Yeah, so they used to. So they lived right throughout New Zealand. So at the moment, I guess we do have them right in the far south and almost in the far north in Hauturu. So they actually live in quite a broad temperature range at the moment. The reason that they live on these remote sites is that because they are the places which are predator free. They're the only places where they could have survived. They're the lifeboats, basically. But as I said, ultimately, we want them to get them back everywhere on the mainland. That's the long-term dream.
Tetra asked, do they have an upper temperature and latitudinal limit?
Yeah, not that we know of. They would have lived right through up Northland. So yeah, as far as we know, they will live well right throughout of New Zealand.
That's quite a long question. I think you answered most of this. Sarah Gibbs asked, can the presenter, that's you, discuss if Kākāpo used to be everywhere? We've done that. Or were they like Takahe and the now extinct subspecies that were different from tussock Takahe? She knows her stuff, of the South Island, lived in the North Island. If the generic viability was thought to be similar, could more North Island sites be found?
Yep, there's no reason why they can't go to the North Island as well. We kind of want to focus on their initial range down here, which is where these remnant Kākāpo came from, so the populations from Fiordland and from Rakiura. But ultimately, yeah, we have Kākāpo in the North Island at the moment on Hauturu, so there's no reason eventually. And our dream is that we'll have so many Kākāpo that we're needing lots and lots of places to put them all over the country.
Megan asks, why are they so friendly?
They're not really that friendly. Some are and some aren't. I guess that you might have seen or you might know of Sirocco. He's imprinted on humans. We have another Kākāpo who are semi-imprinted on humans. They will sometimes seek out human company, and sometimes they won't. But a lot of other Kākāpo will run away when you go near them. Yeah, they're all wild birds, so yeah, they behave like wild birds.
Just had a question just come in. Is there any chance that there are some undiscovered on, say, Rakiura and in Fiordland, in those valleys where the moose are?
I quite like that question. Yeah, I saw that question, and it's one thing. It's very, very unlikely, but it's not impossible, and it could be potentially really quite important for Kākāpo because, as I alluded to in my talk, Fiordland Kākāpo are genetically very different from the rest of our population. We have these two populations. Most of them came from Rakiura. One individual, Richard Henry, came from Fiordland and bred, contributing to the modern population. And those Fiordland birds are so different that if we were to find another Fiordland bird, that could potentially have a huge impact on the genetic viability and the survival of the species in the long term. But there's been a lot of searches done. In 2006, there was a very intensive search in Fiordland for Kākāpo, didn't find any extra evidence. So it's very, very unlikely, but it's not impossible. It's a little bit more likely on Rakiura. If we did find a Kākāpo on Rakiura, it would be genetically more similar to the ones that we have now, but it would still be pretty amazing if we could. So yeah, it's not impossible, but very unlikely.
There's a good question here from Pauline, and I've seen another couple where they've just asked straight out, how can they help your project? What are you looking for?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for wanting to help. And I think the main thing that we would like people to do is just to spread the word, just to make sure more people know about Kākāpo, because that's one of the issues that we have really, is that Kākāpo is an incredible bird species. There's nothing else like them on Earth, but it's very hard for people to see them, because by necessity, they're locked away on these offshore predator islands. So we try as much as we can to get people to see them. So we have Sirocco who will go on tour, and we have chicks, we'll have public chick viewings and people to find them and be able to see them. But yeah, the main thing is just to spread the word, and we want everyone in the world to know what a Kākāpo is, and so that's the biggest thing that we can do. We also, we love donations as well. You can donate via our website, or you can adopt a Kākāpo. We have a really great scheme like that, which actually really supports our work, is really important. So yeah, I guess there's a couple of ways that people can help.
Sandra asked, who and how are those new possible habitats scouted?
So it was who and how, or?
Yeah, who and how are those new possible habitats scouted?
Okay, so that's something that our team do. So our team, we know what Kākāpo like, we know what sort of habitat they like, so we visit sites and we look at the various characteristics of those sites to try and understand whether they'll be suitable for Kākāpo. And I guess the thing with Kākāpo is that they will live quite well in a lot of places. They will live in most habitats in New Zealand, assuming that there's no predators there. The key thing is the breeding. Will they breed there? And so that's one of the things that we'll work towards doing, is if we're looking at a new site, we'd establish a small number of Kākāpo, their male Kākāpo, to see how they go, see how they boom, and then we can find out whether they'll breed. And that's actually what happened with Te Kākahu, or Chalky Island. It was initially wasn't sure whether Kākāpo would breed there. We put some males there. The males have actually been booming. They've set up their bowls. They're actually booming really well. And so it looks like it will be a good breeding site. So there's that difference between where a Kākāpo can live and where a Kākāpo can breed.
Kay's just written, do Kākāpo live individually or in community groups?
Yeah, that's a great question. Traditionally, everyone thought Kākāpo was solitary. You'd hardly ever find a Kākāpo with another Kākāpo. They'd always be on their own. But as the populations have begun to increase on our islands, we're seeing more and more evidence that there might be some sort of social interaction between them. One of our rangers saw 5 Kākāpo in the same tree during our breeding season. I was out on one of our sites recently and found 2 Kākāpo completely unrelated, just roosting pretty much on the same branch on a tree. So we think there's quite a lot of maybe social interactions go on, but we don't know much about it. And I showed you some GPS data, and that's one of the things that we've been using that for, is to try and understand a bit more about how they behave. It's funny, you would think with Kākāpo we'd know everything about them, but we certainly don't. There's lots we still need to know.
Maria asks, how long does it take for a chick to develop into a fledging stage and leave the nest?
Yeah, that's a great question. So normally, when they're in the wild, in the nest, they'll normally fledge at around about 75, 80 days old. So just under 3 months or so. So it's quite a decent length of time. We have hand-reared Kākāpo. Some will hand-rear them if they wouldn't otherwise survive, and they'll normally end up fledging a little bit later, a little bit slower developing. But yeah, just under 3 months for the wild birds.
Somebody just asked, why can we get them at Zealandia in Wellington? Of course, we sometimes do, don't we?
Yeah, so Rocco's been to Zealandia. I guess that we often get asked quite a lot of questions about those sort of sites, and those sites are not really like Zealandia, and not really big enough to have a sustainable breeding population of Kākāpo. We could potentially have small numbers there, but not as a breeding as a breeding site. And at the moment, what we're looking for is breeding sites. We really, really need breeding habitat. So that's what we're focused on. That's not to say that some of those smaller sites could not hold a smaller number of Kākāpo, just a few individuals, for example, for advocacy purposes, or as one of these bachelor pads or something at some stage in the future.
Simon asks, other than the quantity of food, are there other factors that affect the sex ratio of the eggs?
Yeah, not that we know of, but there might well be. I mean, I guess some other nutritional components of the food, not just the amount of food, could make a difference. Otherwise, I don't know of anything, but yeah, I certainly wouldn't rule it out.
Brent wants to know how many breeding females will be breeding next season, approximately.
Yeah, good question. Approximately, I think it's going to be like 70 something. We had about 50 breeding this last year, but some more of these, some of the birds that were chicks in 2016 will be ready to breed. And we're expecting our next breeding season in the south of New Zealand on Anchor and Whenua will be in 2022. We're pretty sure that they won't breed next year, and we can predict when they're going to breed. And it's looking like 2022 is when the next going to breed. So that will be 3 years after that 2019 breeding season.
Megan's just asked what impact is COVID having, if at all, on the birds at the moment?
Yeah, on the birds directly, it's not having any impact that we're aware of. Obviously, all of our work, like everything else around the world in New Zealand, is being impacted a bit. But yeah, we're trying to work as normally as we can.
Jess wants to know what changes or challenges will climate change bring on these birds?
Yeah, that's a good question, and the short answer is we don't know, but I can make some guesses. One of the things that happens with the rimu fruit, so the masting, is it's temperature fluctuations which seem to drive rimu fruit masts. So we know that, for example, if you have a warm summer and then a cold summer, and from 1 year to the next, 2 years later after that, there will be a rimu mast. So if you get greater temperature fluctuations, it's possible that you might have more extreme rimu masts. On the other hand, disease could be an issue. And we had this aspergillosis outbreak last year. It's possible that some climatic conditions might have caused that. So might have caused a greater growth of this fungus. So we might expect to see more diseases. So that's kind of the sort of thing that we're thinking about.
Charlie wants to know, why can't they fly?
Yeah, they would have been able to. So they're of the relatives of the kea and the kaka, which can fly, but they split off around about 29 million years ago. And they did what a lot of New Zealand birds did, is that they didn't need to fly. There was nothing chasing them on the ground, and so there's no advantage flying. And you don't fly unless you really have to. Flying is a really expensive thing to do in terms of energy expenditure. So, yep, they didn't need to. So they just lost the ability to. Although Kākāpo are kind of unusual in that they've got big wings. If you look at, for example, kiwi have got tiny, tiny wings, but Kākāpo wings are quite big, and they kind of look like they almost should be able to fly. But they use those wings for balancing when they're climbing, and they'll climb high up into the trees, 20, 30 meters, and I've seen them balancing on small little branchlets up on top of a tree with their wings outstretched, using them for balance.
Donald here has asked a good question about technology, saying that it's very impressive, and how is that affecting other conservation projects here and internationally?
Yeah, so we like, we try and push the conservation technology. I think it's really important, and I think we do have some technologies which other programs don't. We do get quite a lot of inquiries from people within New Zealand, actually, and around the world, and some of the technologies that we've been using have been employed elsewhere. So it's really great that people can take, for example, some of the transmitter technology, or some of the feeding stations, for example, that technology, and employ it on other places. So yeah, it's great when the stuff that's developed in our program can be directly applied to other species.
Here's one from Dan. How smart are the birds? Because they heard that Sirocco was a very fast learner.
Yeah, they do pick things up really well. I mean, they're a parrot. Parrots are kind of famously clever. And I guess one of the examples is that those feeding stations I showed you, they have to be trained to use those feeding stations. That's not innate, and they do learn to use those quite quickly. So we haven't had any direct measures of how smart they are, but they seem to be pretty intelligent.
We're nearly at the end of our questions, mainly because you'll need a cup of coffee very soon.
That's right.
Is native bush is native bush makeup an issue? Like, do we need to look at remu regeneration as well, or are there enough trees to support new habitat sites?
I think there's probably enough. I mean, more is always great, but I think there's lots of places where there's decent amounts of remu around New Zealand at the moment. The issue is that remu forest is full of predators. Um, but there's obviously more forest habitat would be great for kakapo. And I guess the also thing to bear in mind is we know about remu. We know kakapo breed in response to remu, but they once lived right throughout New Zealand in places where there wasn't lots of remu, so they would have bred in response to other species. We don't quite know what those species are. For example, up on Hauturu, Little Barrier Island, there's not much remu up there. They almost certainly, they have bred up there, they do breed up there, but they breed in response to something else, and we don't quite know what that is. So yeah, having other species of tree as well is obviously hugely important. We just don't quite know which ones those are yet.
It's been great having you. Just one last question from you to the viewers of this webinar, who a lot of them are in the space of predator-free work voluntarily. Can you give them a bit of some advice on the motivation to keep on going as they are?
Yeah, I think it's hugely important, and it's easy to underestimate how important it is. One thing that I've really found working with these species, I used to work with kiwi, Kākāpo, take, it always comes back to that same problem in New Zealand. It comes back to that habitat issue, that real large landscape scale pest control. You need these big sites with not many pests in them, and that starts in your backyard. It really does. And it might well be that if we have places, like Wellington's doing an amazing job of predator control with Miramar Peninsula, for example, and you might end up with areas around cities which have got really low numbers of pests and could be suitable for introduction of some individuals, some species like this. So yeah, it definitely starts at home. And these are, this is the reason I think we're doing all that predator control. This is what we want. We want Kākāpo in our backyards. We want kiwi in our backyards. So yeah, it's amazing that so many people are getting behind it. And yeah, please keep at it.
Finally, just how can we contact you and your team?
Yeah, so you can find us. Actually, you might be able to see there's my Twitter handle on there, so you can contact me like that. We're also on Facebook. If you look for Kākāpo Recovery on Facebook, and if you Google Kākāpo Recovery, we've got a website as well, so you can get in touch with us any of one of those methods.